The forest did not forgive the careless, and Mara had learned that lesson young. But the animal she found at the base of the old ash tree was not careless. It had been ambushed. She heard it before she saw it, a low, continuous sound that was not quite a growl and not quite a breath, something between the two, the sound of something enormous refusing to stop living. She pushed through the hazel scrub at the edge of the Aldenmere and stopped. The wolf was black, not dark gray, not charcoal, not the kind of black that is really brown in daylight. Black the way a starless sky is black, absolute and without apology. It lay on its side in the exposed roots of the ash tree, chest heaving in a labored, uneven rhythm, and jutting from the thick muscle of its left flank was a spear. Not an arrow, not a hunter's bolt. A spear, with a black iron head and a shaft of pale wood that had been carved with markings she did not recognize. Mara stood still for a long moment. She was a healer's daughter, and a healer's daughter learned to read the difference between an animal that would kill you if you came closer, and an animal that was too far gone to try. This wolf was very close to that line, not past it yet, but close. She took one step forward. The wolf's great head lifted barely, and its eyes found her, and she stopped breathing. Its eyes were amber, not the dull gold of a dog's eyes or the flat yellow of a hunter's cat. Amber the way old river water is amber when the light comes through it at the right angle, deep and layered, and carrying something she had no name for. She had looked into animal eyes all her life, and there had never been anything in them that looked back the way this did. She took another step. The growl that came from the wolf's chest was barely a sound at all. It was more like a vibration she felt in her sternum, a warning that had almost no force left in it. The animal was telling her what it could no longer enforce. "I know," she said quietly. "I know you don't want me here." She kept moving. The spear had gone in at an angle. She could see that now. Whoever had thrown it had done so from above and behind, a coward's throw, aimed at something that had been running. The shaft had snapped about a foot from the body, which meant someone had broken it deliberately, to make it harder to remove. That level of cruelty was specific, intentional. This was not a hunter who had mistaken the wolf for something dangerous. This was someone who had wanted the wolf to suffer slowly. Mara set her satchel down on the roots and crouched. The wolf watched her with those amber eyes and did not move. Its breathing had changed, still labored, but the tone of it had shifted. She had seen this before, with a dog that had been badly injured and had given up fighting the person trying to save it, too tired to waste the energy on resistance. The animal had made a calculation, somewhere beneath its exhaustion, and decided she was not the greater threat. "I'm going to have to hurt you to help you," she said. "There's no way around it." She reached into her satchel for her knife. The shaft had been hardened, which meant she couldn't simply pull it free without doing more damage. She would need to cut around the entry point to loosen the surrounding tissue before she attempted removal, and she would need to move quickly, because the blood loss was already considerable. The roots of the ash tree were dark and wet beneath the wolf's flank. She worked with the focused quiet she had learned in her mother's still room, talking all the while not to soothe exactly, but to give the animal something to track besides pain. Her voice was something steady in the chaos of its body. She talked about nothing in particular. The rain that had come the night before. The way the light was falling through the canopy. The name of the ash tree, which was called the World Bridge by the old people of the valley because its roots were said to touch every other tree in the forest. When she worked the blade in to free the iron head, the wolf made a sound that was not quite a howl and not quite a scream, and its whole body shuddered, and she pressed her forearm down across its neck, not to restrain it, but to give it something to push against, to let it know she was still there and not running. "Almost," she said, "almost." She pulled the spear free in one clean draw. The sound that came from the wolf then was barely a sound at all. A long, shuddering exhalation, like something being released. Its head dropped. Its eyes closed. Mara pressed both hands over the wound and began to count. She worked for 2 hours in the fading light. She packed the wound with yarrow from her satchel and sealed it with a resin she carried for deep punctures, wrapping the wolf's flank with cloth torn from her undershirt because she had no bandaging wide enough for the wound's diameter. She built a small fire nearby, not close enough to frighten the animal, but close enough to give it warmth, and sat back on her heels and looked at it. The wolf was still breathing. She should have gone home. She was 3 miles from her father's house, and the path through Aldenmere was not safe after dark, and there was no reason she owed this animal anything more than she had already given it. She had removed the spear. She had sealed the wound. She had done more than anyone could have asked. She stayed. She told herself it was because she needed to know whether the wound took, whether the infection had already gone too deep, whether the work she had done would hold through the night. These were all true things, but they were not the whole truth. The whole truth was that the animal had looked at her with those amber eyes, and there had been something in that look she had never seen before, and she could not make herself walk away from it. She fed the fire and sat and listened to the forest, and the wolf slept. Sometime after midnight it moved. Not dramatically, not a sudden lurch of wakefulness. It was more like a gradual returning. The breathing changed first, evening out from the ragged rhythm of unconsciousness into something slower and more deliberate. Then the ears, which had been flat against its skull, shifted to a more alert position. Then the great head lifted slowly, and the amber eyes opened and found her across the fire. They looked at each other for a long time. "You're still alive," Mara said. "Good." She held her hands out, palms up, over the fire, a gesture that meant nothing to a wolf, but that she did anyway, because it was the gesture she would have made to a person, and something about the way this animal looked at her made that feel like the right thing to do. The wolf made a low sound, not a growl, something else. An acknowledgement, maybe, or the closest approximation of one that the shape of its mouth allowed. Then it laid its head down again and went back to sleep, and Mara sat with it through the long dark hours until the light came back. She returned the following morning with proper supplies. She told her father she had found a wounded dog on the Aldenmere path and needed medicine for an infected puncture wound. And her father, who was a practical man and had long since stopped trying to understand why she did the things she did, gave her what she asked for without too many questions. The wolf was in the same position she had left it, but it was awake, and it watched her come through the hazel scrub with an attention that was different from the first day, sharper, more considered. It knew she was coming. She was almost certain it had heard her well before she entered the clearing. "Right," she said, kneeling to check the wound. "Let's see what we have." The wound had not gone septic, which surprised her. The yarrow had held, and the resin seal was intact. There was heat around the edges, normal for this stage, but no festering, no smell of rot. The wolf was doing something she had never seen an animal do. It was managing its own recovery, regulating its breathing, staying still in a way that was not the stillness of exhaustion, but the deliberate stillness of an animal that understood rest as a strategy. She changed the dressing and did not speak as much as she had the day before, because it did not seem necessary. They had moved past the stage where she needed to keep its attention. Now she just worked, and the wolf held its position with that uncanny patience, and the clearing was quiet except for the birds and the distant sound of the river. On the third day, the wolf was sitting up when she arrived. She stopped at the edge of the scrub and looked at it. It looked back at her. Then it looked at her satchel, with an expression that on a human face she would have called dry assessment. "You're better," she said. It was. The wound had stopped being an emergency and had become a healing, which was a different category entirely. It would scar. It would always scar, given the depth of the iron head's penetration, but the wolf would live. Mara set down her satchel and sat cross-legged on the roots of the ash tree, and for the first time in 4 days she didn't reach immediately for her supplies. She just sat. The wolf looked at her for a long moment. Then, with a deliberateness that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up, it moved. It crossed the 3 yards between them in a slow, measured walk, one careful step at a time, favoring the wounded flank but not being defeated by it. It came to within 2 feet of her and stopped. Then it lowered its head until its nose was almost touching her knee, and it breathed in, long and slow. Mara did not move. She did not breathe. The wolf lifted its head and looked at her. Those amber eyes again, close now, close enough that she could see the rings of darker color within the gold, the depth of them, the thing in them that she had seen on the first day and still could not name. "Hello," she whispered. Then it walked back to its position under the ash tree and lay down and looked away, and the moment was over. But something had happened in it that she could not unhappen. She came back every day for 2 weeks. By the end of the first week, the wolf was eating the meat she brought. Not from her hand, it had not crossed that threshold, and she did not push, but from a flat stone she placed 5 feet away, which it would approach after she had moved back and sat. She found this negotiation fascinating. There were rules being observed, she was certain of that, but they were not the rules of an animal. They were the rules of someone who had been very badly hurt and was learning again, slowly, to consider the possibility of trust. By the end of the second week, the wolf was walking to meet her when she came through the hazel scrub. Not running, walking with that measured, deliberate pace, and it would stand at the edge of the clearing and wait for her to come the rest of the way, as if maintaining its own version of the protocol. She came to you before. Now you come to me. The arrangement is symmetrical. She looked forward to it in a way she couldn't explain to anyone who might have asked, and so she didn't try to explain it. She went to the forest and she sat with the wolf, and the days felt more real on those days than on the days she didn't go. On the 15th day, she arrived to find the clearing empty. She stood at the edge of the scrub for a long time, looking at the ash tree with its exposed roots and the dark stain in the soil where the wolf had bled. There was nothing there. The wolf was gone. She was not prepared for how much that landed. She sat down on the roots of the ash tree and put her face in her hands and did not cry, because she was not a person who cried easily. But she sat there for a long time in the particular silence of a space where something that had mattered was no longer present. She was still sitting there when she heard a branch snap behind her. She turned. The wolf was watching her from the shadows of the birch stand at the edge of the clearing. It had not left. It had moved. She understood then that it had been testing something, whether she would go or stay when it wasn't there to meet her. She understood this with a certainty she couldn't account for, the same certainty she had felt when she looked into its eyes the first time. It walked out of the shadows toward her, and this time it did not stop at 5 feet. It came all the way and lay down at the base of the ash tree's roots, close enough that its shoulder touched her foot. Mara breathed out very slowly. "All right," she said quietly. "All right." She put her hand on its neck, the first time she had touched it without the necessity of medicine, and it let her, and they sat in the clearing in the silence of the afternoon while the light moved through the canopy overhead. That was when she noticed the markings. They were faint, almost invisible under the dense black fur, and she would not have seen them at all if the light hadn't been falling at the precise angle that it was, catching the raised texture of old scars beneath the coat. They ran along the wolf's shoulder blades and down the spine, not random, not the marks of fights and accidents. Deliberate, geometric, patterns she had never seen on any animal. She spread her fingers through the fur, very gently, tracing the lines of the nearest one, and the wolf went absolutely still. Not the stillness of tolerance, the stillness of being found out. "What are you?" she whispered. The amber eyes turned to her, and in them she saw the thing she had never been able to name, the thing that had kept her coming back for 15 days through briars and mud, and the concern of everyone who noticed she was going somewhere and not saying where. she saw a person looking back at her. His name was Kale, and he was the Alpha King of the Aldenmere Pack, and he had been dying when she found him. She did not know this yet. For 3 more days after the moment in the clearing, the wolf crossing to her, the shoulder against her foot, the markings under the fur that her fingertips traced without permission. She continued to come as she had come before, with her satchel and her dressings and the meat wrapped in cloth, and the wolf continued to receive her as it had received her before, with that uncanny, calibrated attention. But something had shifted between them, and they both knew it. The wolf began to follow her. Not far, never past the edge of the clearing, never toward the valley and its human paths. But when she rose to go, it would walk with her to the hazel scrub and stand there as she pushed through, and she would turn at the last moment, and it would be watching her go with the amber eyes, and she would feel that watching as a warmth between her shoulder blades for the whole walk home. She told no one about this. It was not that she feared being thought mad, exactly. She had been thought a little odd her whole life, in the way of people who spend more time in forests than in parlors, and she had made her peace with that assessment. But there were no words that didn't make it sound smaller than it was. I found a wolf, it's healing, it walks me to the edge of the clearing, and she had no desire to put small words on something that felt large. So she kept it in, the way you keep a fire in, contained and tended and not shared until it is ready to be shared. Her father noticed something because her father noticed most things. He said nothing, which was his way of saying everything. He simply kept the still room stocked with the things she reached for most often, and once, coming home later than usual to find him reading by the window, she caught an expression on his face when she came through the door, not relief exactly, but the particular look of someone who has been holding their breath without knowing it and has now, quietly, let it out. "Good walk?" he asked. "Good walk," she said. He went back to his book. He did not tell her this immediately. The telling came in fragments, over 3 more days, in a form she was not expecting, because she had not expected him to shift at all. She knew enough of the old stories to know that words existed, had always existed, had walked the forest alongside her people since before either of them had a written word for what they were. But the old stories also said the old packs were gone, had been gone for 2 centuries, had withdrawn to somewhere deeper than any human path went. She found him in human form on the morning of the 16th day, sitting with his back against the ash tree, wrapped in a length of dark wool that she had left the week before because the nights had turned cold and she had no other logic for the gesture. He was tall even sitting, dark-haired, with the stillness she recognized from the wolf, and when he looked up at her, she saw the amber eyes and stopped walking. He said nothing for a long moment. "You should be afraid of me," he said at last. His voice was deep and roughed at the edges, like something that had not been used in a long time. "I know," she said. She sat down across from him as she had sat across from the wolf, cross-legged and not running. "I'm not." He looked at her for a long moment, with an expression that was impossible to read. "Why?" he asked. "Because you let me remove the spear," she said. "You could have driven me off. You were close enough to gone that I would have believed it was the wound talking, but you let me do it. Something in you decided to let me." He looked away at the forest. "That was not a choice," he said. "That was simply running out of options." "Most choices are," she said. He looked back at her, and despite himself, something shifted in the amber of his eyes. Not softness exactly, something more difficult than softness, recognition. His name was Kale, and he was 34 years old in human counting, which meant something different in were reckoning older, but not in the ways that showed on the surface. He was the Alpha King by blood and by the old law of the Aldenmere Pack, which meant he was responsible for 300 souls who lived in the deep forest beyond the ash tree line, and he had been ambushed 15 days ago by men who were not his pack and not quite human. He told her this the way people tell things they have kept too long, in pieces, not looking at her, as if the words needed to escape sideways rather than being said directly. She listened without interrupting. She had learned that from her father, who said that a healer's most underused tool was silence. The men who had thrown the spear were called the Veth. She had no frame for the word, and he explained it as best he could in terms she could use. A faction, old, organized, with a specific grievance against the pack that was old enough to be more religion than politics by now. They had been hunting him for 2 months. They had been patient. They had learned his patterns, his preferred territory, the route he used when he wanted to think, which was the route along the Aldenmuir's eastern edge, which was where she had found him. The Veth's grievance, he explained, was one of those things that begins as a wound and calcifies, over generations, into doctrine. 200 years ago, the pack had held territory that the Veth believed was theirs by an older claim, and there had been a conflict, and people on both sides had died, and the pack had prevailed, and the survivors of the Veth had carried the loss forward the way you carry a splinter you can't reach, not incapacitating, but never truly forgotten either, something you were always aware of at the edge of awareness. Over the centuries, the grievance had acquired ritual and language and leadership, had become a structured thing with its own internal logic. The original loss was real, and Kale did not argue that it wasn't. But the response had calcified too, become something that could no longer be satisfied even in principle, because what it wanted was not restoration but annihilation, and those were not the same thing. He said this sitting against the ash tree in the wool she had left, and he said it with the careful flatness of someone who has thought a thing through so many times that all the emotion has worn off it, like a river stone smoothed by water until it is all surface and no rough edge. She could hear, underneath the flatness, what it had cost him, not the thinking of it, but the carrying of it, the long weight of responsibility for something he had not made but had inherited and could not put down. "You've been trying to end it," she said. "For 7 years," he said. "Since I became Alpha," he looked at the forest. "My predecessor tried to end it by force, and that only deepened the calcification. I have been trying to end it by other means, by taking the things that feed it away one by one." He paused. "It takes longer." "It takes longer," she agreed, "but the stone smooths." He looked at her. "The river stone," she said. "You can't break a calcification with force without making fragments, but water over time." "Yes," he said, "that is exactly it." A pause, and something shifted in his voice, a fractional change of pressure. "You said that as if you had been waiting to say it." "I was thinking it while you were talking." He was quiet for a moment. "Most people don't think while I'm talking. They wait." "Waiting is not the same as listening," she said. The amber eyes moved to her again with that deep, layered quality, and the morning light was coming through the bare canopy now, breaking into pieces across his face, and she thought, "There it is again. The thing I don't have a name for. Whatever it is patient, and it is large, and it is looking at me." The spear had not been an ordinary weapon. The markings on the shaft, the ones she had not recognized, were a binding, a specific kind of working that was designed to prevent the shift. A Wur who could not shift could not heal in the accelerated way of the pack, could not call for help in the way of the pack, could not do anything except bleed and weaken and eventually stop. That was what the Veth had intended. What they had not intended was Mara. "The binding held for 11 days, he said. "You kept it from mattering." "The yarrow kept it from mattering," she said. "The yarrow held the wound." He looked at her. "You kept it from mattering." She felt the distinction he was drawing, and did not argue with it. "They're still looking for you," she said. It was not a question. She had been aware over the past 2 weeks of something at the edges of the forest, not anything she could see or hear directly, but a pressure, a quality of attention in the undergrowth that didn't belong to deer or fox. She had attributed it to imagination. She revised that assessment. "Yes," he said. "And now they've been watching me come here for 15 days. "Yes." which means they know you're not dead. A muscle moved in his jaw. Yes. Mara looked at the forest around them with the same clinical attention she brought to a wound. She was already mapping it, the sight lines through the birch stand, the approach paths, the positions of the oldest trees whose root systems would give cover. She had grown up in this forest. She knew it in a way that was different from knowing a map. "Then we should go," she said and stood up. Cale looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't read, and then he stood as well, and she noticed that the movement still cost him something. The wound was healed to the point of function but not fully, and he was managing the remainder through will rather than recovery. He would have to shift again before the healing completed itself, and he couldn't do that safely here. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know," she said. "Where are your people?" Something happened in his face. Not quite an emotion she had vocabulary for, something older than the ones she knew. He looked at her for a long time. 4 miles north," he said, "past the Standing Stones." "I know where the Standing Stones are," she said. "I'll take you there." They moved through the forest in the way she would have moved with any patient whose mobility was compromised, at a pace he could sustain, with her reading the terrain ahead and picking the line of least resistance. He was quiet behind her, and she understood that the quiet was not hostility. It was the quiet of someone who had not been cared for in a long time and didn't know what to do with it. She heard the Veth before she saw them. It was not a sound exactly, more an absence of sound, the forest going silent in a wave 30 yards to their left, the birds pulling back, the small rustling of undergrowth stilling. She had spent enough of her life in the Aldenmere to know what it meant when the forest went quiet in a directional way. Something was moving fast and with purpose, and it was not moving away from them. She put her hand back and touched Cale's wrist. He stopped immediately. She turned to look at him and saw that he already knew. The amber eyes were sharp and tracking left. His body language completely changed, the patient deliberateness replaced by something older and colder. "How many?" she asked very low. "4," he said, "coming from the northwest." "Is there another way to the Standing Stones?" He was quiet for a fraction of a second, which told her the answer before he spoke it. "Not a fast one." "Then we don't go fast," she said. "We go quiet." She turned right, away from the approach, toward the oldest part of the forest where the oak canopy was thick enough to cut the light to a perpetual green dusk, and the root systems made the ground impassable to anything moving quickly without knowledge of it. She had played in this part of the forest as a child. She knew it the way she knew her own hands. Cale followed her without question. She moved in the way the forest had taught her, not the way a person moves who has been trained to move quietly, which is a performance of stillness, but the way a person moves who has spent 10,000 hours in the woods and learned to inhabit the rhythm of it rather than impose on it. She stepped where the roots were, where the moss was, where the sound was absorbed rather than reflected. She felt Cale behind her matching her pace, and she was aware with a peripheral awareness that he was not simply following her. He was reading the forest as she read it, a different frequency but the same fundamental attention. The Veth passed 40 yards to their left. She heard them at that distance, 4 sets of footfalls, 2 heavier than the others, the particular sound of people who could move through forest but had not grown up doing it. They were tracking by scent, she realized. They moved in the pattern of people following a trail rather than searching. But she and Cale had come to this part of the forest from a different direction than his original approach, and the scent trail they would be following was 4 hours old and heading east. She held still in the shadow of a massive oak and felt Cale come to a stop beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and they waited while the Veth passed and the forest slowly, in a wave, came back to life around them. Neither of them moved for a long time after the sounds faded. Then Cale said, very quietly, in a voice that was different from any he had used before, something stripped of its careful flatness, something underneath the surface. You were not afraid. I was afraid, she said. I was very afraid. But you kept moving. That's what afraid is for, she said. It tells you what matters, then you move anyway. There was a silence. My people have a word for that, he said. What word? He said it in his language first, a sound that was all breath and low consonants, and then he translated it, and the translation was not a single word but a phrase, and the phrase was something close to the courage that knows the cost. They reached the standing stones an hour before dark. She had been to the stones twice in her life, as a child, with her mother, great gray uprights arranged in a formation whose original purpose no living person in the valley could explain, though the old stories had their theories. The stones looked different now. There were lights among them, low and scattered, the kind of lights that come from fires banked carefully for concealment, and there were figures moving between the stones who saw Kale and became still as the forest went still. Then one of them ran. She was young, perhaps 16, in human reckoning, with dark hair and amber eyes like his, and she ran with the specific recklessness of someone who had been holding fear in for a long time and was now putting it down. She crossed the ground between the stones and Kale in what seemed like no time at all, and collided with him so hard that he staggered a half-step back, and she grabbed the front of his borrowed wool and held on with both hands, and said something fast and fervent in his language that Mara did not understand but understood perfectly. Kale's hand came up and rested on the back of the girl's head, and something happened in his face that had not happened in all the time Mara had known him. The careful, managed stillness dissolved, and for a moment he was simply a person who had come back from somewhere very far away to somewhere he hadn't believed he would reach. The others came then, adults mostly, some older, gathering in a way that was not a crowd but a pack, something organized and instinctive at the same time, moving into positions that made sense to them in ways that she couldn't fully follow. They looked at her. She looked at them. Kale said something in his language, and several pairs of amber eyes moved to her and stayed. He switched to her tongue. "This is Mara," he said. "She found me, she kept me alive," a pause, "she brought me home." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of people taking something in, reordering their understanding around a new fact. Then the old woman who stood closest to the largest stone, gray-haired, short, with eyes that were not amber but gray-green, the eyes of someone who had been in the world a very long time, said something in his language that made several people close their eyes briefly, and he translated it without being asked. "She says you walk like someone who knows the old trees," he said. "She says that is not a human thing." "My mother taught me," Mara said. The old woman looked at her for another long moment, and then made a gesture with one hand that Mara did not know, but somehow understood to be welcome. She spent 3 days with the pack at the Standing Stones. She had not planned to. She had planned to see him safely delivered and then go back to her father's house and her regular life, which was the rational thing to do. The rational thing was always clear enough to her. It was just not always the thing she did. On the first evening, Kale shifted. She had not watched it happen before, or rather, she had not watched it happen consciously, because she was nearly certain that what she had seen on the 15th night in the blue dark before dawn was not the sleeping form of a wolf becoming a man by any mechanism she could have described. She had been half asleep herself, and she had filed it under the category of things that the mind does at the edge of sleep, which is a capacious and forgiving category. This was different. He shifted at the edge of the stone circle in the light of the pack's fires, and what happened was not violent and not dramatic, which surprised her. She had expected something like transformation as the old stories described it, agonized, effortful, requiring the full commitment of pain. What she saw was more like water becoming ice, a change of state rather than a change of shape, the same underlying structure moving from one expression of itself to another. The black wolf between one blink and the next simply was not there, and Kale was, standing in the firelight in the wool she had left in the clearing, with the amber eyes and the still, governing quality of presence. The pack received this with practical warmth, not celebration, just the resumption of a normal order of things that had been disrupted and was now restored. The girl who had run to him, his sister, she would learn, who had been managing the pack's affairs in his absence with a competence that clearly drove her to her limits, and a refusal to acknowledge that clearly came from the same bloodline, appeared at his elbow immediately with something to eat and something to drink and a specific look that said, "We will be discussing how this happened at length, but not tonight." He looked at Mara over the girl's head, and the amber eyes said, "I know. I owe you a considerable amount of explanation." It was the pack's healer, an older man named Davin who had gray in his hair, and the careful hands of someone who had spent decades practicing an art he took seriously, who actually gave her the opening to stay. He looked at Kale's wound on the first evening and looked at Mara and asked, through Kale's translation, exactly what she had used and in what order, and the conversation that followed lasted 4 hours and went far past the language barrier in a way that conversations between people who share a technical passion sometimes do, moving into gesture and demonstration and the shared vocabulary of the work itself. She learned things from Davin that she could not have learned anywhere else. She showed him things he had not seen. By the end of the first day, she had been given a place by the fire as a matter of course, and no one had asked her to leave. She saw Kale operate in his actual context for the first time during those 3 days, and it was different from anything she could have anticipated. The careful, closed quality she had known in the forest was still present, but here it was a governing quality rather than a defensive one. The steadiness of something load-bearing rather than something braced against impact. People came to him with things, and he listened with complete attention and made decisions with a directness that was not unkind. He moved through the camp, and the camp organized itself around his movement without apparent effort. She watched this and thought about the wolf lying under the ash tree, refusing to stop breathing, and understood something she had not had language for before. The body and the bearing are the same thing, at root. He had been an alpha even dying. She just hadn't known what she was seeing. On the second evening, he found her sitting at the edge of the stone circle, looking back toward the valley, and sat down near her with the same deliberateness with which, as a wolf, he had crossed the clearing to lay beside her. "You could stay," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the valley, not at her, which was the only way he could have said it. "You know I can't," she said. "I know you think you can't. My father is alone, my work is there." She paused. "I'm a human woman, Kale. I know what you are." He turned to look at her then, and the amber eyes had the same quality they'd had in the clearing on the day he first came to her, close, layered, carrying something. "I know better than I knew anything before the spear, and I have known many things." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's not a small thing to say," she said. "It's not a small thing to mean." The fire crackled. Somewhere in the camp a child was laughing, the particular unguarded sound of a child who feels safe, and the sound sat in the quiet between them and did not crowd it. "I'll come back," she said, "to the clearing. If you want me to." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "The clearing is 4 miles from your father's house." "Yes." "And you came every day for 2 weeks." "Yes." In the dark through the briars, he looked at her, 4 miles. "The path improves significantly after the 2nd mile," she said. "The briars are mostly on the eastern approach." His mouth moved. It was the first time she had seen that happen. "Then come back," he said. She went home on the 3rd morning. But she came back. Not every day, as she had during those first 2 weeks. That was not sustainable, and they both knew it. But regularly, with the consistency that is more meaningful than frequency, showing up at intervals that her father eventually stopped asking about because he could see that whatever was happening in the forest was making his daughter more herself rather than less, and a practical man knows what to do with that. He asked once whether she was safe, and she thought about it honestly before answering and said, "Yes." He looked at her for a moment with the healer's assessment she had inherited from him, and apparently what he saw satisfied something, because he nodded and went back to his book. The clearing settled into itself. It was a different place in autumn than it had been in summer. The hazel scrub went gold and then gone, leaving the approaches more open, and the ash tree's canopy thinned until she could see the sky clearly through it for the first time, great blue rectangles between the bare branches. She started arriving earlier, because the light through the open canopy was better for reading, and she was working on a particular problem in pack medicine that Davin had given her, a treatment for the kind of fever that followed an interrupted shift, which had no equivalent in human medicine, but which could be built from analogy if you were willing to work sideways. She liked working sideways. It suited her mind. Kale would arrive to find her sitting on the roots of the ash tree with her notes spread around her, and he would sit across from her, and for the first half-hour or so, they would each be occupied with their own work. He had a pack to run, even remotely, and the running of it involved correspondence she found fascinating to observe, the way decisions moved through him and came out as instructions that had both his authority and his consideration in them. The way he could hold 6 things at once, without losing the quality of attention on any of them. Then, at some point, one of them would say something, and the other would answer, and the notes would be put away. They talked about everything. That was what surprised her most, not the depth of the conversations, which she had perhaps expected given the nature of what they were, but the breadth. They talked about medicine and governance, and the mechanics of the old treaties between the pack and the valley settlements, which had existed for centuries, and which nobody in the valley knew about anymore because the memory had drained out of the human side of the arrangement while the pack side had preserved it. They talked about grief. He had lost his father, who had been his teacher and his benchmark, 4 years before, and it had left a specific kind of absence in him that she recognized from her own mother's death when she was 12. They talked about the stars, which he knew by different names than she did, the pack's constellations having different shapes because they had been named by people who spent their nights differently than valley folk did. They talked about small things too. The taste of the water from the spring near the standing stones versus the spring in the lower Aldenmere. The right way to build a fire for warmth versus a fire for cooking. The question of whether the gray squirrel she had seen 3 weeks running on the path north was the same squirrel or different squirrels, and how you would tell. She came to understand, through these conversations, that he had been lonely. Not obviously, not in the way of someone who has been cut off from company. He had 300 people who depended on him, and a pack that was his family in the deepest sense of the word. But the kind of loneliness that comes from being the heaviest thing in the room, from being the one whose steadiness everyone else leans on, from having no one to whom you could be, occasionally, less than steady, that kind he knew very well, and it was the kind that company does not always fix. She thought she might be good at fixing that kind. She had been good at it with her father, who was the heaviest thing in most rooms he entered. You did not fix it by taking the weight from them. You fixed it by sitting down next to it with them, by being the one person in their day who was not asking for the weight to be managed. She didn't say any of this to him. She just kept coming back. The clearing became something other than a clearing. It became a place with a specific atmosphere and specific rules, half hers and half his, negotiated without discussion in the way that shared spaces develop their protocols when the people sharing them are paying attention. She brought her notes on plant medicine, and he brought his knowledge of the pack's old healing traditions, and they talked about the places where the two systems touched, which were more places than either of them had expected. He told her about the Veth in more detail as the weeks passed, their history, their grievance, their organization, the particular kind of patience that groups with old hatreds develop, the way they had been building towards something for a long time, and the spear had been part of that building. He told her this not as a warning exactly, but as something he was sharing with her because she was inside his perimeter now, which was a statement he made without making it, in the way that things between them were often said without being said. She thought about this sometimes, the way they communicated in the register below words, the way she had always known what the wolf was telling her even when wolves don't tell you things, the way the amber eyes had always been legible to her in a way she couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't been there. She thought about the old stories her mother had told her, the ones about the people who walked in both worlds, the ones who had blood from before the separation of kinds. She didn't say this to Kale. It felt like a thing that needed to unfold on its own schedule. The Veth came back on a Tuesday in October when the leaves were down and the Aldenmere was a different forest, skeletal and gray and beautiful in the way that bare architecture is beautiful, all structure and no ornament. She was in the clearing when they came. She had been there for 2 hours. Kale had not yet arrived, which was not unusual. He was sometimes later than she was, and she was comfortable in the clearing without him by now, comfortable enough to read or work on her notes while she waited. The first signal was the birds. She put her notes down and stood. They came from 3 directions this time, which told her they had learned from the last encounter. More of them than 4, 7, she thought, listening to the weight and distribution of footfalls, though she could not be certain. They were moving with more confidence than last time, which meant they had a plan. They had stopped relying on the scent trail and were triangulating. She had been thinking, since Kale first told her about them, about what she would do if this happened. She had not told him she was thinking about it, because he would have found a way to discourage her from involving herself further, which was a thing he did regularly, and which she regularly and cheerfully ignored. She had the practical stubbornness of someone who has grown up in difficult terrain, not the dramatic resistance of someone being heroic, but the steady refusal to be pushed by weather. She had 3 things. She had a fire already lit. She had a clay pot of the resin she used for wound sealing, which was highly flammable. And she had a very precise knowledge of the Aldenmere's old root systems, which created passages and dead ends that only looked like level ground from above. She moved to the east side of the clearing and waited. When the first of the Veth broke through the hazel scrub, large, dark-coated, with the particular quality of presence that said were rather than human, she was not where they expected her to be. She was above them, standing on the high root of the ash tree, with the burning branch from the fire in one hand and the open clay pot in the other. "I know this forest better than you do," she said clearly, in the flat voice she used when she was not afraid of something even though she was afraid of it. "And I know where the old drainage roots run under this clearing. You're standing on them right now, all of you." She tipped the clay pot. The resin hit the root systems and ran along the channels she had known were there, and the fire she put to it caught in a line not dangerous, not spreading, not a blaze, just a running line of contained flame along the root paths, enough to make the ground beneath the Veth's feet suddenly, viscerally uncertain. They scattered. Not all of them. 2 of the larger ones held their positions because they were experienced and they knew she was a human woman with a clay pot, and fire in a forest in October is not the weapon of someone rational. But the formation was broken. And a broken formation, her mother had told her once, speaking of something else entirely, speaking of negotiation, is an agreement that hasn't happened yet. She heard Kale before she heard the Veth recover. He came from the north, from the direction of the standing stones, which meant he had been coming when they came, had known, with whatever sense gave him knowledge of his territory, that something was wrong in the clearing before he arrived. He came through the birch stand the way she had first heard him in the forest, as a quality of attention preceding a presence, and then he was there. He was not in wolf form. He was in human form, which was more frightening, because in human form what he was carried differently. An alpha king in wolf form is a wolf, enormous and terrifying, a thing the Veth had hunted before. An alpha king in human form, standing at the edge of a clearing where someone they had cornered is still standing upright and unafraid, is something older and harder to categorize. He did not shout. He did not posture. He looked at the Veth with the particular attention she had come to know very well, complete, without flinching, and he said one thing in their shared language, and the tone of it was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, that this was over. She would ask him later what he had said exactly, and he would tell her, and the translation was something close to, "The old wrong has been heard and witnessed and carried long enough. Put it down." One of the Veth, the eldest, she thought, a woman with gray in her coat and a stillness that mirrored his own, looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at Mara, standing on the root of the ash tree with her burned-out branch and her empty clay pot. Then she looked back at Kale. She said something, just a few words. "She asks if you knew what you were choosing," Kale said to Mara, without taking his eyes off the Veth woman. "When?" Mara asked. "When you took out the spear." Mara thought about this, the wolf lying on its side in the exposed roots, the amber eyes finding her, the sound of something enormous refusing to stop living. "No," she said honestly, "I just knew I couldn't leave it." The Veth woman was quiet for a moment. Then she made the same gesture the old woman at the standing stones had made, and Mara recognized it this time for what it was. Not simply welcome, something more specific, something closer to, "I see you as you are." They withdrew. Not quickly, not with the scattered urgency of people defeated, but in the deliberate way of people who have made a decision. She watched them go and understood that this was not the end of the Veth and their grievance. That was too old and too deep to resolve in a clearing in October. But that this particular chapter of it had reached a pause point, which was a different thing from resolution and more achievable in an afternoon. When they were gone, the clearing was very quiet. Kale crossed to the ash tree and stood below her, looking up, with the amber eyes and the expression she still did not always have language for but had come to read as she read the forest, not by naming everything in it, but by understanding the overall quality of the light. "You tipped burning resin on the drainage roots of a forest in dry autumn," he said. "The resin doesn't actually spread if you apply it along the channels rather than across them," she said. "The soak pattern is contained. It burns out in under a minute." She paused. "I tested it." "You tested it?" "Last week in the lower clearing." She stepped down from the root. "I wanted to know if the theory held." He looked at her for a long time. "You were going to fight them," he said. "You knew they were coming and you were going to fight them, with a clay pot." "With specific knowledge of the terrain and a clay pot," she said. "There's a difference." "Mara." "Kale." He was quiet. The amber eyes moved over her face in the particular way they had when he was working something out, and she held still for it, as she had held still on the first day, understanding that the attention was not threatening even when it was thorough. "I came back," he said at last, "as fast as I could come." "I know. I didn't want you to be alone in it." "I wasn't afraid," she said. And then, because it was true and because they were past the point where she needed to manage what she let him see, "I was afraid, but I knew you were coming. I felt you coming through the forest before you arrived." He was very still. "You felt that," he said, carefully, as if the words had specific weight he was placing down rather than speaking. "Yes." "That is not a human thing," he said, which was what the old woman had said about the way she walked. "No," she said, "I don't think it is." The forest was quiet around them. The last light of the afternoon was moving through the canopy in long gold angles, and the ash tree's bare branches divided it into something almost like a design, and the clearing smelled of char and damp earth, and something she could not name that was present wherever Kale was and had always been present. Since the first night she sat across the fire from a dying wolf and felt, with an inexplicable certainty, that she was in the right place. He reached out slowly, the way he had moved in the clearing in wolf form, deliberate, paced, giving her every moment to decide otherwise, and his hand came to rest against the side of her face, and she turned into it, and the amber eyes were very close. "I knew from the first day," he said. "I knew what you were when you put your hands on the wound and talked to me as if I could understand everything you were saying." "You could understand everything I was saying," she said. "Yes," he said, "I could." His thumb moved across her cheekbone just once, and the gesture was the wolf crossing the clearing to lay at her feet, was the careful protocol of approach and waiting and approach again, was 15 days of learning whether she could be trusted with something that had not been trusted for a very long time. She put her hand over his hand. "Whatever I am," she said, "I came to the right tree." He looked at her with the amber eyes, and in them she saw everything the forest had been teaching her since she was a child who came home muddy from the Aldenmere, and told her father she had been talking to the trees. That the wild things and the careful things are not separate categories, that the healing work and the staying work are the same work, that the bravest thing is not the grand gesture but the returning, the small unremarkable act of coming back to the place where something matters and sitting down in it again. "Yes," Cale said quietly. "You did." Above them, in the crown of the ash tree, the world bridge, the tree whose roots touched everything, a bird called once, and the Aldenmere answered it, and the clearing held them both in its familiar, patient dark.